I need you to find in the book of Acts, chapter 16. It's going to be the first 10 verses in chapter 16, book of Acts. While you're finding that, I'll tell you a little bit about providential relationships. Never really heard that expression before, but Andy Stanley, in his book Deep and Wide, talks about providential relationships. And what he means by providential relationships are those relationships that come along that somewhere kind of at the time and the place that they come along, they have an impact on you. Sometimes it seems like at just the right time, at just the right place, God brings us to someone or brings someone to us, and it makes a profound difference in us. Do you know what I'm talking about? There are those relationships that God seems to provide that take us, if you want to put it this way, that take us to a little bit different place in our faith, or what we might say, as we might say around here, that make Jesus real in a new or a deeper way. I thought about this week, and I kind of looked back on my life and realized there were all sorts of those kinds of things, but there were 3 at different points in my life. One when I was just starting in junior high school. Isn't that interesting? Those of you here, some of you have heard my Georgianne McBrayer story, which is she was my youth leader. I don't remember a thing she taught. I remember her. And then there was one in college. I was on a track heading for law school, I thought. And I was placed in this situation, and there's this person who was there who just poured into me and challenged me to rethink some things. And then as I was finishing college and ready to kind of consider as far as ministry, there was a third. He was my pastor, and he changed me. So, those are some of mine. Do you have some? Someone God brought across your path at just the right time, it seemed. And Jesus was made a little more real, more meaningful for you. Every now and again, in the scriptures, we see this a lot. We see these providential relationships. In Acts chapter 16, we actually see a relationship like that born. It's Acts chapter 16, first 10 verses. We see what would be a providential relationship in the life of a young man, and we see its birth. It's really something. Do you have your scriptures? Do you have them open? Acts chapter 16, starting, it's going to be the first 10 verses. Acts 16. And he, that would be Paul, came to Derbe and to Lystra. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, son of a Jewish woman who was a believer. But his father was a Greek, that is, a non-Jew. And Timothy was well spoken of by the brethren who were there in Lystra and Iconium. And Paul wanted this man to go be with him. And so he took him, circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that part. They all knew about his father being a Greek. And while they were passing through the cities, they were delivering the instructions, which had been decided upon by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem for them to observe. So the churches were being strengthened in the faith and were increasing in number daily. And they passed through Phrygia and the Galatian region, having been restricted or forbidden by the Spirit to speak the word in that area. And when they came to Mysia, they were trying to go into Bithynia, and the Spirit of Jesus didn't allow them to go there either. So passing by, they came down to Troas. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing and appealing to him, saying, "Come and help us." And when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. That's an interesting story. Let's pray. Father, I pray you would speak to us, not only what we need to hear, but what you need for us to hear. And I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Please keep your Bibles open. What we have here is, like I said, we're kind of in the maternity ward of a providential relationship, and we see it born. And here it is. It's a relationship between Paul and Timothy. And I want to take just a little bit of time to make sure we understand the players in this particular relationship, okay? There is Paul and there is Timothy. I'm going to focus on Timothy first. We're told some things about Timothy in a very, succinct sort of way. We're told some things about Timothy. First of all, we're told he's a disciple, which means follower. I'm going to pin that down just a little bit more. Whenever the scriptures use the idea of disciple and they attach it to somebody, it means someone who's starting to take Jesus seriously. There are a lot of folks that when they come to Jesus, they're kind of cynical about Jesus. You know what I'm talking about? You run across these folks, all you have to do is wander around online and see some of the comment lines and threads and stuff, and you'll see there's folks who take a very cynical view of Jesus. I remember one time reading something, and there was like this little discussion going back and forth about Jesus, and this one person, he just kind of posted and he said, Jesus was just a fool who went and got himself killed. There are those who see it that way. Now, it says something about them, I think, but nonetheless, there are those who have a very cynical kind of view about Jesus. But there are also those, they don't really do that. They have what I would call more of a sentimental view about Jesus. They like the story and it touches something in them, and they kind of want to say, yeah, that's good. You know what I'm talking about? But it's kind of sentimental. In other words, there's not a lot of depth to it. It's just kind of the emotional, I like the story of this. Here is my experience, okay? I think within the past couple of weeks, I think that there have been all sorts of Cubs fans that were just kind of born. I don't think that you really had people who were serious. There are those who are very serious about their Cubs. I get it. I'm not one. But you know what I found out about myself? I was kind of pulling for them. You know why? The sentimentality of it. I don't follow them. I don't really keep up with the players. I don't know a whole lot as far as things as far as division and all that. But you know what? I started kind of pulling for the Cubs. Why? Sentimental favorite. I'm not invested in them. There are those that sometimes we come to Jesus, let's just be honest, and there are those who really like the story. And it gives them a certain feeling, and there's a sentimentality to it, but they really haven't bought in. Does that make sense? They're just a Cubs fan, right? They're on the wagon for now because they like the story. But the scriptures, whenever we see and they use the word disciple, it always means this. These are those who've come to take Jesus seriously. Meaning, we take seriously what he said. We try to do it. And we try to do as he did. We follow. That's what we're told about Timothy. Timothy is someone who had come to take Jesus seriously. And we also see this, ironically or interestingly, in terms of his name. In the Bible, names have meaning. Have I talked to you all about this? Names carry significance. We tend to pick out names according to what sounds good and what has a good rhythm to it. You know what I'm saying? And so like when Jen and I were thinking as far as names for our guys, we didn't really go into the significance of the name. We just went into, well, what has a good rhyme and rhythm to it? You know, as long as it has a long Y in the name and 5 letters, then everything else kind of goes around. So I won't embarrass them by saying what their middle names are, but you kind of have the whole thing. You with me? Parenting, you know what I'm talking about. In the scriptures, names have significance. And you know what the name Timothy means? One who honors God. We're shown something about this young man. He's a disciple. He's taking Jesus seriously, and he's kind of showing true to his name. He's one who's wanting to honor God. We're told that he's spoken well of by others in the faith. In other words, people look at him and they say, it's the real deal. He's not playing games. He's not going through the motions. This guy's the real deal. We're even told about his family situation. Did you pick up on that? His mother was a Jew and a believer. His father's not a Jew, and we're not told if he's a believer, but my guess is that if his dad was a believer, we would have been told that. So here's this young man growing up in a mixed family at multiple levels, right? Jew and non-Jew, believer and apparently non-believer. And that about encompassed it in those days. If you weren't a Jew, you're a non-Jew. He grew up with both. Are you a believer or are you not? He grew up with both. You think he'd be able to connect with a whole lot of different people that way? You're Jewish? Hey, my mom's Jewish. You're not Jewish? Hey, my dad's Greek. You're a believer? Hey, I'm a believer. You're not a believer? Hey, I grew up with a father who wasn't a believer. And that's player number one in this. Here's player number two, Paul. Now, I'm not going to dig into Paul's story a whole lot. I would hope that some of us know it pretty well. But here's the main thing we need to know about Paul. By Acts chapter 16, he is now recognized as a leader. He had been doing some ministry once Christ came into his life, but he is now recognized after the big meeting in Acts 15. You can read that on your own. The big council meeting, and they validate him. They recognize him as a leader. That's one level. Here's the next level. Ready? Paul recognizes something in himself about leadership that he didn't know before. You know how I know this? Because he's not called Saul anymore. He's called Paul. And he's embraced the new name. Do you know why that's significant? When he's named after Saul, who all knows your Old Testament? Who is the first king of Israel? Saul. And what are we told about Saul? He stood head and shoulders above everyone else, which means Saul was a big deal. And when Paul was originally born and given the name Saul by his parents, you know what that means? We think you're a big deal. But something happened to Paul. When God made the move and Christ came into his life, and by Acts chapter 16, he isn't called Saul anymore, he's called Paul. And you know what Paul means? Little one. And he embraced it. Meaning, humility came. He didn't see himself as a big deal anymore that had to have everybody else see him as a big deal anymore. He understood he was little. Listen to me. We don't have enough humility among Christian leaders. Too many want to make themselves a big deal, and the irony is, in the secular world, the move more and more is toward humility because they're figuring out that when the leader understands himself with appropriate smallness, other people can be developed. Paul recognizes something in himself. He isn't such a big deal. And the third thing we see Paul recognizes is he sees something in Timothy. Did you see it? Keep it open. He sees something in Timothy and he says, I want to get in his orbit and I want to bring him with me. And those are the two players. Those two players and Paul's vision in regard to Timothy, he sees something in him and he says, I want to bring that out. I want to bring him along. Literally, I want to bring him along with me. And that launches these two onto the path. And the path is a path of investment. And this is what's really fascinating to me. It is a path. It is not a program. Okay, some of you know I'm taking classes, and it's just because I don't have enough stress in my life, I guess. So I'm taking some classes, and for my last go-around, I was kind of looking through some literature there at the theological library, and I'm looking through that, and I'm looking at doctoral programs and papers that have been written by students in past years, and I'm looking through this, and one of them is on people development. That captured me, because it's always been a passion of mine. And I started reading it, and the whole thing is a program, and I thought, the problem with having a program about that sort of stuff is it's not the way Jesus did it. And it's not the way Paul did it. So why are we trying to put together a program when what Jesus said is this? You remember in Mark chapter 3, he goes up on the hill and he's got all these folks and he prays. And he prays for guidance in choosing the 12 who would be with him. This isn't a program. This is a path that you take together. And the idea of investing in somebody isn't, okay, here is now session 3. It is, we're going to walk. We're going to go. We're going to do together. You're going to be with me. And you see what Paul's going on? See what's going on with Paul, with Timothy? He sees stuff in Timothy and he says, I want him to go out and be with me. That's the path. We must be clear. In this story, in this episode, their path isn't just to Phrygia or to Galatia. Their path is, Timothy, come with me. You want to see how to do ministry? Come with me. When Timothy goes with Paul, listen, when Timothy goes with Paul, he gets exposure and experience. He sees it. He is a part of it. He doesn't read about ministry. He sees Paul minister to people. He sees Paul deal with situations. He sees Paul deal with problems. He sees Paul encourage people. He sees Paul deal with difficult situations. And guess what? That exposure, that experience forms something in him. Right? I'm going to go next. By going with Paul, he gets clear about what the mission is. This isn't some political venture on their part. Politics has nothing to do with this on this trip. Right? This is not for financial gain. They're not out on some money-making deal. This isn't recreational. It isn't just we're here to do some sightseeing. What's going on? They are here to touch and change lives. This isn't about recreation or finance or politics. This is about God. This is about life change. This is about changing someone's forever. Timothy gets exposure and experience and understanding. Here's what we're trying to do. This is what Paul's given his life to do. They're given a message. I don't have time. Okay. In Acts chapter 15, here's the deal. Tell me if this is getting confusing. But the backdrop to this whole deal, in Acts chapter 15, there's this whole discussion about what lets you in on the kingdom. You had Jews who become Christian, but now there are people who aren't Jews and they want to become Christian, so what do? So they have this big hoo-ha and this big conversation about, then finally James says, and we ought to underline this with that, he says, we should not make it too difficult for someone to come to Christ. I thought, oh my goodness, how many churches we make it so difficult. But then they come out and they said, okay, Paul, Barnabas, we're validating you as leaders. Here's what you need to let these folks know. If they aren't Jews and they're wanting to become Christians, here's what you need to let them know. Number one, they've got to reject any idolatry. You've got to worship God and God alone, not God plus your little household idol. You can't bend the knee to anything else. Make sense? Makes sense to me. Here's the second one. Fornication. That is, sex outside of marriage. The basic idea is simply this. There is a moral component to what we're doing. There is a moral component to following God. And if we think that there isn't some moral change, then we've missed the message of Jesus. Because Jesus didn't come just to change the definition of sin. Jesus came to save us from sin. So we can't keep living in it. So, idolatry, you don't bend the knee to any other god. And fornication, we say that there are moral things that align our lives with God. Make sense? Then, he says, don't eat anything that's been strangled or that has the blood in it. Huh? These are ceremonial things. And the power of any ceremonial, listen, the power of any ceremonial instruction like that is cultural. Meaning, when they tell Paul and Barnabas, you need to give people these instructions in regard to don't eat anything strangled, don't eat anything that has a blood in it. What that's getting at is this. Hear me out. You don't consume what everybody else is consuming. You are different. You are different from your culture. Don't be afraid to be different from your culture. So, if we want to translate that to our world today, don't consume what everybody else is consuming, meaning maybe we have to say, I'm not big on MTV. Everybody else is consuming it. I don't. I'm not that big on certain sites on the web. I don't consume that stuff. Maybe we have to say, you know what? We decided to cut that part off of our cable because that's not something we want to feed on. Does that make sense? Hello? It will put you at times at odds, but the point is we're different from our culture. That's the message they were given. One other thing on this path, and that is Timothy, by being with Paul, finds exposure and experience in the movings of God. Did you notice in 6 through 10? They're looking on where to go, and it says the Spirit said, no, not there. And they take another look, and they say, yeah, well, we'll just go this way. No. And then we see that Paul has some sort of a vision, and they realize that's where God's hand is leading now. Where does Timothy learn that? If you go back in Acts chapter 9, Paul has some visions. If you go back in Acts chapter 9, he and those around him hear the whisper of God. He knows a bit about it. For Timothy to learn about the way of God, spend time. Be with Paul. Make sense? You following? You tracking me? Okay. Now, one of the things that's important is that in daylight saving time, I believe, at least for Sunday, you're supposed to set your clock back an hour and 5 minutes. Please give me 5 more minutes, okay? Because there's more. In chapter 16, verse 5, Luke always likes to, Luke is who wrote Acts, and he always likes to put this little bow on things when he kind of, and so we're told in Acts chapter 16, verse 5, after Paul and Timothy go and do these things, we're told 2 things happen. It gets a 2-part summary, which is the churches are what? Strengthened and lives are increased, right? Lives are touched. Listen, you guys. Because Paul invested in Timothy, the church got stronger. Right? I'm not trying to put people on the spot, but let me just say a few things here. We talked a little bit about Wednesdays, and there's been all sorts of dynamics and excitement and challenges and all that, but let me tell you, part of the thing with the youth part of that, the middle school and high school, the kids hear more than Barney's voice. They hear Myra's. They hear Crystal's. They hear Tyler's. Do you see why that would make the ministry and churches stronger? Middle schoolers don't just hear my voice and interact only with me, but with Chris and with others. Why is that? There are folks, believe it or not, I know it's a stretch, there are folks who won't connect with me. There are folks that sometimes may not even be too thrilled with me. There are folks in my own family that aren't too thrilled with me. I'm sorry, I just saw that little girl motoring around, little Genevieve. So, okay. There are folks who would not have necessarily connected to Paul, but guess what? They'll connect with Timothy. And so if you have Paul and Timothy, now they've doubled their ability to reach and touch people's lives. You follow? That's why the church gets stronger. When people step up, they take a risk, they take a step, they say, you know what? I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable or qualified, but they do it. They take a step, and then they find it pours something into them. And then they find that they are able to connect with other people that weren't connected with before. The church gets stronger the more people we invest in. And lives are touched the more we invest in people. Because now we have different people with different experiences, different levels of understanding, different perspectives, different backgrounds that can now speak to a variety of situations. The church gets stronger, more lives get reached. Make sense? This is what we're called to do. Jesus is made real when we invest in people. When we invest in people, they are then equipped to be difference makers. That's the summary, but there's one other subtle thing that if you're not careful, you miss it. And it's in verse 10. And the subtlety is this. There's a change of the pronouns when you get to verse 10. All along through Acts chapter 16, it's always in the third person in reference to Paul and Timothy. They went. They then met. It was then shown to them. You follow me? But in verse 10, it changes from third person to first person. And it says, we, us. Do you pick up on that? Do you know what that means? Luke has bought in. The investment of Paul to Timothy somewhere now has become Paul, Timothy, and Luke. It's the first time in the book of Acts that we see him use the first person in describing what's going on, because now he is in on it. We talk about making Jesus real. And it can be just talk. We can think this is just some lifestyle stuff, and I need to lead a clean life, and I need to know what I believe, and I need to be willing to help other people, and that's all true. But listen, in Acts chapter 16, Jesus is made real because Paul invests in Timothy. And by doing that, the church gets stronger, more lives are reached, and then we see someone else start to emerge to be invested in. I've had three that stand out or more. I don't know who comes to your mind about those who are those providential relationships who poured into you or invested into you. Maybe you don't have any or very many, and I'm sorry if that is the case. But I think God is calling you like he calls me or Paul or Timothy to start investing in someone. Write this down, please. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. It's easy to remember. It's a bunch of twos. Okay? 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul writes much, much later now. He and Timothy have walked a long path. And then we're told. He writes to Timothy and he says, listen, what I have entrusted to you, what I have poured into you, you in turn entrust to faithful men who in turn will teach others. You follow it? Paul to Timothy with the expectation that Timothy will do for somebody else what Paul did for him, and that Timothy will do it in such a way that who he pours into will be able to pour into somebody else. 4 generations. That's how Jesus is made real. Whoever poured into you, that makes you Timothy. It's time for you to start investing in someone else. Come along with me. Let's do this together. That's all I got.